Hello and welcome to the Khairion podcast, your guide to everything concerning the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Hello and welcome, dear listeners. I'm Katarina Hildebrand, the CEO of Khairion, and I'm very excited to welcome you back at our podcast series. Our guest today is our research lead, Dr. Elias Dahrouge, from the University of St. Joseph in Beirut, and Khairion's research lead. Welcome, Elias.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Today, we are going to discuss the issue of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, one of Elias's main areas of research. So let's begin. Lebanon has traditionally been a crossroads of cultures and ethnicities. Also, it is an immediate neighbor with a deeply intertwined and complex relationship with Syria. So it was the obvious choice for many refugees fleeing the Syrian civil war. What is the situation of Syrian refugees in Lebanon now, and how did we get there?
So first of all, as you mentioned, let's go a little bit back in history and see how Lebanon actually is a country where throughout the past century and even before, it was a place of refuge for a lot of communities. So let's go back at the creation of Lebanon. You know that Lebanon was created in 1920 by the French Mandatory Authority. And during that time, you had already a large first refugee group who came to Lebanon. And these are the Armenians following the genocide in central Anatolia. Many of them sought refuge in Lebanon. And since that moment, you also had, during the 20s, you have many Christian and other minorities coming from nowadays Turkey, Syria, Iraq, who established in Lebanon. But also you had a lot of Kurdish people coming to Lebanon, but who were by the Lebanese state not recognized as being refugees. And mostly because of the religious background of these. You know that during that time, the main authority in Lebanon, what we call at that time, you had the Christian elite who was ruling in Lebanon. And the Christian elite wanted to always favor the demographic balance of Christians. So Christians during that time were given the Lebanese citizenship, so the Armenians and other Christian minorities, whereas other Muslim minorities coming, like the Kurdish, for example, they were not granted the status and were never recognized as such. Many of them actually became stateless and could not access any citizenship because they moved out from their homeland before even the creation or the fixation of nationality and nationality laws in these countries. The next and very notable migration or refugee inflow to Lebanon is the Palestinian refugee inflow, which actually happened in 1948, following, all well, the Nakba. You had at least 50,000, if not more, of refugees who came during that period to Lebanon and established in camps and are still living there. But also, they were granted a special status of refugee status, but outside of the UNHCR, because you know that it's the UNRWA who is responsible of dealing with the Palestinian refugee crisis. And then you had many other constant flows. I can mention a few that people are not familiar with. You had, for example, a lot of Jews even leaving from Europe during that period of time and coming, but not being accepted in mandatory Palestine, which later became Israel. You had a lot of them actually coming for a certain time in transit refugee migration to Lebanon. But you also had Armenians from Turkey who came to Lebanon before being resettled to third countries. And this is why Lebanon gained actually its identity today of being a transit country. And from there, you had also many other flows from other Arabic countries. For example, in the 60s and 70s, when nationalization was going on in Syria, a lot of the Christian elite industrials, they sold everything just before losing everything. And then they came to Lebanon and invested in Lebanon, their monies. They opened factories, etc., helping Lebanon again in its economic development in the 60s and 70s. And yes, of course, you have then the parenthesis of the civil war, but later also you had many other refugee flows. Starting 2003, for example, you had many Iraqis especially Christian refugees who came from war-torn Iraq following the American invasion of Iraq. Many of these Christians were waiting to be resettled in other third countries like, North America or Europe or Australia. Again, Lebanon became a transit country. And finally, this is how we arrived to the biggest and most challenging of all, which is the Syrian refugee crisis. Because following the unrest that started in Syria in 2011, with between the opposition factions and the Assad regime, you had slowly and then exponentially at least 1.5, at its peak, actually, you had 1.5 million of Syrian refugees who came to Lebanon. Now, very good that since the last census in Lebanon was made in 1932, we don't know exactly how many Lebanese citizens are residing today in Lebanon, but we can estimate that between 4 and 5 million Lebanese are living in Lebanon. So with 1.5 million Syrian refugees added to the officially 500,000 of Palestinians, plus all the other refugee groups, Lebanon soon became the country with the highest refugee per capita ratio in the world. So and it was also very challenging.
How did the Lebanese government deal with such a disproportionate amount of refugees in the country?
That's an excellent question, because you know that in Lebanon, because of its political system, which is based on what we call the consociational democracy, which is based on the power sharing of all communities, you need to have consensus over every decision in the government. And the different political parties had different views and different priorities for this refugee crisis. So, as usual, guess what happened in 2011, 12, 13? There was no decision made. So we can divide the government's response, the Lebanese government's state response, into 3 different phases. The first phase starts in following the crisis, 2011, up until 2014. These 3 first years were called as, or defined as being governed by a policy of no policy, or others named it the ostrich policy, like the ostrich that puts its head in the sand. This is what happened in this period because Lebanon did nothing and let everything to be like going organically. They let everyone enter. There was a no-camp policy applied, unlike, for example, in Turkey or in Jordan with the Al-Zaatari camp, one of the biggest refugee camps worldwide. In Lebanon, Syrians were just flowing in and establishing themselves anywhere they could find, or they can rent out or find a place to get some tents, because even the tented settlements in Lebanon, the camps, are actually financed by them. So they are renting out the land from the landlords. And then the NGOs and the UNHCR was coming to establish for them some sanitary and other kind of services. But during this period, with the no-camp policy, of course, you may ask why. Why? Because of these dissensions within the government. You had people who, for example, let's say like the Christian parties, some of the Christian parties, they wanted to prevent something like the Palestinian precedents. So establishing camps for them was something like making possible for a protracted long stay, which would be difficult to manage. That was part of what Hezbollah also, for example, and the Amal, so the Shia tandem, the 2 Shia parties in Lebanon, they also were afraid, but not from this side. They were afraid from security reasons, because establishing such a camp would make more easy, for example, to the development of jihadi extremist Sunni groups within that. So they were very much afraid of this. Then we entered the second phase. The second phase is the policies of exclusion. These policies of exclusion are the policies when the Lebanese state started to think that, okay, now we have to find something and let's make it clear to show Syrians that they are not welcomed anymore. And they asked UNHCR to stop registration. And also they imposed legal restrictions over Syrians. So their presence in Lebanon had to be linked to a visa or other employment regulations like the kafala system. What happened because of that? De facto, more than 2/3 of Syrian refugees on paper, they became illegal residents. And gradually, we moved to the third phase, which is when the Lebanese government started actively, starting 2016-17, to actively advocate and work for the resettlement or repatriation or refoulement of Syrian refugees. These policies were very much fragmented, so their effect was not very efficient, but we had at least we've documented at least 14,000 of Syrian refugees who were resettled or resent to Syria during this period.
How are all of these events reflected in the local economies and the microeconomies?
It's very interesting to see this because a lot of people, when they imagine this refugee crisis, they think that just out of nowhere, we have a flow of 1.5 million person who are coming into the country. But we often forget that actually before the crisis and before the Syrian civil war, you already had between 300,000 and 500,000 of Syrian workers in Lebanon working in less qualified jobs in, for example, mainly agriculture, construction, etc. And they were essential to the Lebanese economy because they are cheap labor. Following the war and the crisis in 2011 and onwards, these actually, for example, the agricultural workers, instead of going back to Syria after the agriculture season is off, they stayed in Lebanon and then they brought their families in to live with them. So why I'm telling this? I'm telling this because the effect on the Lebanese economy is mitigated and it's open to a lot of debates. First, when these ex-workers who became de facto refugees with their families established themselves in Lebanon, actually, it meant that instead of sending remittances back to Syria to their families, with their families, they were spending this money in the Lebanese economy. Plus, you had all kinds of humanitarian and NGOs coming to Lebanon, along with the UNHCR, and flooding Lebanon with a lot of in-kind and humanitarian and cash assistant aid, which actually was mainly also spent in the Lebanese economy. But from the other side, you know that 1.5 million people in a country is very heavy on the Lebanese infrastructure, on the environment, and even on the labor market, because these cheap workers were actually competing with the Lebanese people who were actually being more and more impoverished during this period. So a lot of Lebanese maybe lost some of their jobs, etc., because of their presence. So again, it's very much mitigated.
Thank you very much. How does the Lebanese majority population view this issue?
Now, the Lebanese population in general, it started by, of course, a lot of Lebanese have relatives in Syria, affinities, especially from those who are from the same community. Since these Syrian refugees were mainly from the Sunni Muslim community, they were very much welcomed, especially in the beginning. And also knowing that the Lebanese suffered from the Assad regime because Lebanon was under Syrian occupation for more than at least 15 years, but they entered actually the country in 76. But then starting in 1990, you have the Pax Syriana, this period of 15 years until the assassination of Rafiq Hariri, which was under the rule of the Syrian presence of Lebanon. So they were more or less compassionate, but very much afraid, especially the non-Muslim communities, non-Sunni Muslim communities, because in Lebanon, you always have this fear of a demographic imbalance. So the perception shifted quite rapidly towards something that was more or less perceived as being a threat to the Lebanese identity, a threat to the Lebanese economy as well. Like even the Sunnis at some point, the host communities, were seeing that. And you had a lot of issues, even in remote areas, bordering areas like in Akkar, when the aid was coming for Syrians, the Lebanese population was fed up and started to stop these aids because they perceived that they were not actually helped. And actually, this shifted the humanitarian assistance because they started to assist also the host communities. This was also very much helped and fueled by the political parties. The Lebanese political elite is very much always searching for scapegoats. the Syrian refugees were the perfect scapegoats for the last 15 years. So what happened is that every political, economic problem and failure was attributed to the Syrian refugees. Instead of seeing in them the positive things and how to profit from their presence, even in a very pragmatic way, they always they did even in media, they did hatred media campaigns against them, showing always the bad sides of them. And actually, it fueled also a resentment within the population. And of course, the Lebanese population, because of the protracted and compounded economic crisis that started in 2019, is very much sensing, we can sense a sort of a fatigue within Lebanese, which is reflected also on their perceptions, their negative perceptions towards Syrian refugees.
Has there ever been a unified response to all of this from the side of the Syrian refugees residing in Lebanon?
You mean the Syrian refugees, if they...
Yeah, whether they ever unified and give a response to all these reactions from the Lebanese government and the Lebanese public?
The Syrian refugees were, because of their structural condition, which is very much vulnerable and marginalized as a community, because they have actually no real rights. You have to know that the Lebanese state is a non-signatory of the 1951 Refugee Convention and its protocol of 67. So actually it does not officially recognize them as being refugees. And this was also translated in their own narrative, because as per the Lebanese state, the refugees are not called per se, they are called as being displaced. Whatever this means, because we know that forced displacement, when it's international, it's being a refugee. So in Arabic, they are called nazihin rather than being laji'in. You know, laji' means refugee, whereas nazih means displaced. Why I'm telling you this? Because of this marginal position, they were never able to group themselves into some kind of single voice to voice out their demands, etc. So unlike, for example, the Palestinians in the 60s and 70s, and maybe you have small elements where they were able to do this. For example, I remember 1 or 2 years back from now, you had some Syrian refugees and Syrian workers protesting in the Bekaa region, for example, when the governor there and the state started to shut down their businesses because they were illegally opening them. But beside these ad hoc events, they never could voice out their demands in an organized way.
How is the situation evolving after the fall of the Assad regime a year ago?
Yeah, so we have to know that since the fall of the Assad regime, the entire situation shifted. Because you have also 2 other elements that started earlier. I already mentioned, for example, the economic crisis that started in Lebanon in 2019, which marginalized the Syrian refugee presence in Lebanon, because a lot of them now were even more vulnerable to harsh economic conditions, etc. So some of them were started to think to move abroad or go back to Syria, although many of them could not because of many reasons related to their relationship with the Assad regime. And this can be shown in the trends, in the exponential surge starting 2019 of the maritime migration through illegal routes. So a lot of boats started to go from Tripoli and North Lebanon towards Cyprus and other European countries, which shows actually this new migration trend. But later on, you know that in 2023 and 2024, Lebanon had also an episode of a violent war between Hezbollah and Israel. And during this period of time, more than 1/3 of the Lebanese population were displaced. And here we talk about Lebanese and non-Lebanese residents in Lebanon. For example, thousands of Syrians became secondary displaced. So they were Syrian refugees, but then they had to move again because of the Israeli strikes in the regions where they were living. And like Lebanese, who actually went back to Syria, who went as refugees to Syria, around 200,000 Lebanese during this period went to Syria, you have also 300,000 of Syrians who moved back to Syria as returnees because they were now fleeing the violence in Lebanon during this war episode. But we all know that many of them, because they have jobs in Lebanon and better economic conditions, and the Assad regime was still in power, they came back through illegal or irregular routes because the border is very porous between Lebanon and Syria. And then comes what you mentioned, the fall of the Assad regime. The fall of the Assad regime actually had made new trends and it was a twofold impact on the refugee situation and dynamics in Lebanon. Why? Because you might imagine that a lot of these Syrian refugees in Lebanon, they were no more concerned actually of the political and security situation in Syria, because finally what for them was a very bloody tyrant felt, and so they could go back. And especially in the beginning with the euphoric period, the 2-3 first months, a lot of them actually went back. But with the new government in Syria established, the government of now Al-Sharia, previously Al-Julani, what happened is that you had a new wave of massacres and atrocities committed especially against the minorities, religious minority groups in Syria. We can recall, for example, the March massacres against Alawite in coastal Syria, but also the many rounds of violence and massacres also committed against the Druze in Aswaida area in last summer, plus all kind of small different events, like, for example, even the bombing of the St. Elias Church in Damascus this year. This led to a new wave of displacement, of new refugees coming towards Lebanon, that we can now say that they are around more than 100,000 newcomers came to Lebanon. Out of them, we have at least 80,000 of Shia Syrians from Damascus area, but also from Homs area. Many of them were Lebanese, mixed with Syrian families also who came because they had lands there in this region. And from towards North Lebanon, Akkar and Tripoli, you had more than 36,000 Alawite Syrians who came, and they were escaping actually the violence and massacres in coastal Syria in the last spring. And you also have a lot of underdocumented cases, like, for example, Druze. We know that we have a few thousands who came and established in Beirut, around Beirut, in Alay, for example, who actually escaped from the massacres, because you know that the Druze, even the Druze in Syria, they are originally from Lebanon. They went there mostly in the 18th century following the Ain Dara war, conflict battle. And these have a lot of kin and family ties with the Druze of Lebanon. So a lot of them actually came within their extended family networks. And you also have a lot of Christian Syrians, but also a lot of Muslims who do not identify with the new regime, which is a little bit taking an Islamist turn, and are trying to escape either to Lebanon as a first destination, and from there towards other regions. Again, Lebanon becoming a sort of a transit country.
Thank you. My last question for today is, what perspectives do you see on the development of the issue?
Actually, it depends. If you see now the situation, we all know that Syria is far away of being now completely pacified, completely reunited, and also under a real trend of development. We all know that, for example, the Druze areas are still under very ruled by Druze forces, and the situation between them and the regime is very fragile. We've seen also that Qasad, so the Kurdish regions, are still also, of course, negotiating with the government, but there is still no way out, concrete solution for their incorporation within a unified Syrian and pacified Syrian state. We all know that a lot of the Syrian forces, within the Syrian forces, you have a lot of foreign fighters. You also have a lot of people who have question marks on them. We can think of the Amshat, for example, of Abu Amsha, who committed a lot of atrocities in diverse regions. So the situation in a security level, especially for minorities, but even for others, is still very unclear. So I don't see that these categories would now feel safer to stay in Syria or to go back for those who fled. Second, we, even for the majority, for the protracted Syrian refugees, those who are in Lebanon since 2011, we've seen that a lot of them are not considering yet return because of many reasons. But first of all, it's the economic situation in Syria. Despite the wishful thinking that's happening and all the media campaigns, concretely nothing has yet happened. And just think about the housing issues. So the Assad regime bombed and destroyed entire neighborhoods. So these people have nowhere to go back. And even if they would invest and reconstruct by their own means and hands, you need infrastructures, you need schools, you need sewage system. Unless there is a real Syrian Marshall Plan, there will be no mass return of Syrians. Plus, don't forget that a lot of these Syrian refugees are very well established. They have work in Lebanon, etc. And the Lebanese economy actually, whatever the rhetoric of the Lebanese political parties, the Lebanese economy needs them in the economy. So they are staying. And the last interesting point is to see, for example, the gender differences. We've seen UNHCR reports in which they actually interviewed household members that are led by female Syrians, refugees, and they are less keen of going back to Syria because they found themselves more secured in Lebanon, where they already established themselves. They see themselves as living in a society which is maybe more liberal, where they can do entrepreneurship. Whereas in Syria, they still are a little bit unsure of how this new government will be dealing, for example, with women themselves. And finally, we've seen the difference also perception between youth and older generations, because those who were born or raised or socialized in Lebanon, they never lived in Syria. So they are reluctant of going back to a country that they don't actually know, where they've lived in Lebanon for so long, all their life actually. So the future is still very much unclear. And we'll see how this would evolve, but definitely not something we can't expect a massive return in the near future.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dahrouge, for this very interesting podcast, and I'm looking forward to welcoming you again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Khayriyan podcast. We are looking forward to sharing with you more exciting news on the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. For further information, please follow us at khayriyan.com, as well as on X and LinkedIn.